For more on the conflict in Iran, we are joined by Phil Klay. Phil is a United States Marine Corps veteran, and he's also an English professor at Fairfield University in Connecticut. So, Phil, you wrote this really fascinating opinion piece for the New York Times entitled, "Trump has made a fundamental miscalculation about Iran." And you, no doubt, heard the conversation we were having there with our White House correspondent, Ed O'Keefe. At one point in your piece, you write that the president maybe wants unconditional surrender, but maybe unconditional surrender is a thing that happens inside the president's mind, regardless of whether our enemies have actually surrendered. Maybe the war is quite contained, but maybe Americans throughout the region need to leave. Maybe there will be ground troops, maybe not. So the question, of course, as a veteran, as someone who's served, as someone who understands the language even that is being used to describe this conflict, is it your feeling that the president has miscalculated? Did he, in your mind, think that this bombing campaign would not only lead to the death of the Ayatollah, but more importantly, lead to a popular uprising that would overthrow the regime as we know it, overthrow the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or at least get them to be more malleable when it comes to the United States' interests? And because that hasn't happened, he's looking for an off-ramp.
I mean, it's hard to know what the president believed. He said all sorts of things, a lot of contradictory things, which leaves us as American citizens in this bizarre perspective where we can't trust our own commander-in-chief to tell us what we're trying to do and why we're doing it, which is, I think, something probably felt much more keenly for Marines, soldiers, sailors in the region. And as far as miscalculations, I mean, it's pretty obvious that he has. He admitted as much that they hadn't anticipated some of the moves that Iran has made. Certainly, I very much doubt that when they started this, they thought that they would be removing sanctions from Iranian oil and making it easier for Iran to sell oil as a consequence of attacking Iran. So it really does seem as though they thought that Iran would capitulate in the early stages, that they would be so impressed by our military might that they wouldn't respond in the way that, frankly, a lot of Iran analysts have assumed they would respond for decades.
And Phil, you talk about the rhetoric this administration has been using toward this war. You know, despite the kind of varying reasons for the war, you write that one rationale for this war has remained clear and consistent: the administration's delight in displays of violence and domination. I think when we see the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, speaking about this war, he often uses a lot of kind of warmongering language when describing our mission there. As someone who has served, who's been overseas deployed, there's the actions directed by our military, and then there's the rhetoric. Why is the rhetoric so important?
So, I mean, one thing, just within the military, a lot of the real tough guys that I know do not talk like this, right, with this sort of blustery braggadocio. And certainly, it is part and parcel of a worldview that the administration seems to have around what we can do with violence, right? What you can do with spectacles, displays of power and dominance. So, you know, throughout this war, we've seen a million different justifications for why we're going to war. But there's been this constant thread of tough talk, social media videos, whether they're intercutting, you know, video games with images of bomb strikes, and just a real kind of delight in any imagery of destruction, coupled with statements from the, you know, Secretary of Defense saying we negotiate with bombs, or similar types of things. And there's a couple of problems with that, which is, first off, in order to justify war, right, which just means, even in the best case, wide-scale human suffering, right, even in an immaculate war, which this already is not, you need a very clear and defined moral purpose to justify it, right? And this is something that American presidents, going back to the founding, have been very, very clear about. And also, you need to have an acute understanding of the fact that simple acts of violence and cruelty do not, in and of themselves, shift the underlying political reality. Ultimately, you want a new political sentiment, right? A different relationship with the country that you're at war with. And that needs to be baked in at the level of strategy. And there's no evidence that that's the case.
You write that in your op-ed, and I thought it was really beautifully stated, where there's something that almost seems not of this country when you hear the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, use the kind of language that he uses when describing the actions of the United States military. For example, when he says we are punching down, and language that if another world leader, if another defense minister used that kind of language in regards to the United States, if the Germans or the Japanese had used that kind of language around American or British or French troops during World War II, that would have potentially led to them appearing in Nuremberg, right? And here we are using that kind of language. And the reason I say it doesn't seem of this of our country is because you point out in your op-ed that George Washington, as a general and as the leader of the revolutionary forces, when he received word of British atrocities against the American militia, said that their wanton cruelty injures rather than benefits their cause, and that with our forbearance justly secures to us the attachment of all good men. And more pointedly, you use the example of Abraham Lincoln during the Gettysburg Address with malice towards none, and even though the rebel cause was completely antithetical to the Union cause. So when you then have to explain to a Gold Star father, as our Jonah Kaplan did in a really touching interview, a Gold Star husband with the husband of a service member who lost their life, what we are fighting for. It's easy to point to we're trying to contain fascism, or we're trying to liberate concentration camps in World War II, or we are fighting to contain communism because that is perhaps a danger to us here in the West. But how do you then answer to somebody like yourself who's fought in wars, why we're there and why a soldier, an airman, a Marine lost their life?
This is precisely what they have failed to do. And I think that is a real serious moral failing. I think it's also a failure in terms of your democratic responsibilities, right? You know, one of the reasons that war-making power is supposed to rest with Congress is when you go to war, because it is the most morally serious thing that you can do as a country, you want the entire nation behind you. And it should be an expression of the democratic will. That is not what we have here. The president never made the case that we need to have a war with Iran. He just did it clearly in the hope that it would be over quickly. And now it seems like things are escalating and we don't know what's going to come and how bad things might get, which is always a possibility when you roll the iron dice and initiate a war. And this was done with particular thoughtlessness. And so you can't say that there's one rationale. They've given us 17.
And so when this is all said and done, what will it have been for, Phil?
I mean, that remains to be seen. I certainly hope that the takeaway that the American public has, and certainly the takeaway that I hope people in Congress have, is that we need to actually return to some of the ideals of the founders, have much more congressional oversight over war, and have a much more restrained president when it comes to war making. Because if you allow the whims of one man to decide whether we initiate a conflict with a major power that can, create devastating effects in a crucial region of the world for the whole globe, that's a very dangerous situation to be in, and it's not at all what was intended when we began this nation.
And I should just point out, I know we have to wrap this up, Phil, but we should just point out that everybody understands how heinous and how horrific the Iranian regime is. Everybody understands that their threats to destroy Israel, to destroy Americans,
I'm a veteran of Iraq. They have killed a lot of American service members. I have no sympathy for that regime, which is evil and has slaughtered its own people. That is not the nature of my objection.
Yeah. Phil Klay, thank you very, very much. I encourage everybody to check out your opinion piece in the New York Times. It really gives a lot of food for thought. We appreciate it.
Thank you.